Hi, everybody. My name is Olga Bolotina, and I'm happy to welcome you to the In the Know again, another Friday. Thank you so much for joining us. And I appreciate everybody's interest. And I have to admit, this is, there is always a first. So today, the first happened for me when I had to reschedule speakers. So Hop Hopkins was scheduled for today. And unfortunately, he couldn't join us, so he's coming next week, and that's great. But I am so delighted and so happy to introduce Xavier Johnson, who been so kind and so gracious to join me today. He actually was supposed to be next week joining me. So Xavier, thank you so much for stepping in, stepping up, and being so kind and so pathetic. Really appreciate it, and I just can't wait to get to know each other better. So Xavier and I met each other through Sierra Club. Xavier is on the Northern Alameda County Executive Committee of the Sierra Club. That is one of the groups of the San Francisco Bay Chapter. And Xavier is doing a lot of work, especially on the housing, on the renters protections issues. Very connected to the community. Xavier just got his passed his bar so he is a lawyer. Yay! Congratulations. You got your degree from UC Berkeley, right?
Correct.
Yeah. And Xavier works for Centro Legal de la Raza, and Centro Legal de la Raza in Oakland, doing a lot of work for the community, making sure that underprivileged communities that have been traditionally left out, just get all the help that they need, especially in the housing crisis. And you're doing a lot of work for renters, for renter protections. And you live in Berkeley also, right? You're also on the Berkeley Rent Advisory Board. Is that? I mean, Berkeley has so many boards that I'm sometimes getting confused.
Yes, I mean, they really focus on public engagement in Berkeley, which is something I've grown to appreciate, the opportunities that we get. But I'm the Housing Advisory Commission in Berkeley.
Okay, got it. And you're also running for?
The Berkeley Rent Stabilization Board.
Rent Stabilization Board. All right. At some point, maybe we should distinguish for people
yes.
what is doing what.
Yes. Agreed.
Yeah, I've been an advocate, and I'm getting lost. Of course, we do a lot of work in Oakland. So, but thank you so much for joining again. I really appreciate you and all your work you're doing. So, I'm always, and we talked a little bit before we went live. So it's like, how do you get your passions? Where do they come from? Where did you start? So maybe you can mention a little bit where you grew up, how you grew up, and what which events started your passions.
Sure. So I was born in Detroit, Michigan, but I've lived in Florida, North Carolina, Connecticut, Texas, and now California. So I pretty much spent all of my childhood and growing up life pretty much moving all over the place. And I think one of the things that's affected me is I definitely love kind of meeting new people. Like I think people sometimes get intimidated by that if they haven't moved around a lot. But I think because I've had to pack up an entire life and build an entirely new one in places, I kind of love meeting new people. And I think that what kind of created my passion really stems from seeing the opportunities that I had because the privilege that my parents eventually held, being able to go to college, and then seeing some of my family members who didn't have that same opportunity, and just how our life circumstances have just been different in different ways. And I think at the end of the day, my passion stems from this frustration that there's so much inequality in the world, and that just where you happen to have been in one moment in time can really affect your entire life trajectory. And so I've described myself as like a masochist for change before. Like it's not even like, it's just like I feel like it's something you just have to do to make the world a better place, even though it really kind of it can be draining sometimes too. But I think it's just we have to do it to make the world better.
So did you say that your parents did go to college, or?
My parents were able to go to college.
And are they also activists, or?
Not quite. My mom's a teacher, so she's active in that way, but they never really were like the activist types. I think actually the protest going on right now is at least the first time I can recall that they've ever participated in protests before. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, speaking of teachers, I mean, you sort of an activist every day, especially in the United States. You know, when I first realized that teachers in the United States of America had to buy all the school supplies on their own minuscule salary. I was like, this is insanity. This is insane. This is just that it didn't compute for me, and it still doesn't. It's just really like, how can you in one of the most developed countries in the world, you have a system like that? So that's
well, and as I mentioned, my mom's a teacher, but we moved around so much. So every time we moved to a different place, she'd probably teach a different grade in a different state. And so every time we'd have to get entirely new sets of school supplies too. And I remember I actually volunteered in our class really often. And that I didn't really thought about that as like forming how I became today, but I definitely think that played a part in it, like helping to educate and see what future generations can do and become. I think that's another fundamental thing I believe in terms of organizing and advocacy, because I think a lot of the problems we want to see solved today are probably going to be solved in future generations before we get to see the complete resolution.
That's true. But you mentioned, I just realized that my mom actually also, she's an engineer, but she switched to be a teacher to be closer to me. And I think that I also had to go to, to her school, to her class, hang out. So, but I think that you're right. It's probably had something to do with, I think we both are more extroverts and sort of community driven. So I think that probably has something to do.
A little bit.
Are you the only child in your family?
I'm not. So I have a younger brother and a younger sister.
Okay. They live here in California with you, or?
My sister lives in Utah. My little brother lives in Texas, actually. So we're kind of spread all over now.
Why did your parents have to travel so much? Is it?
I think it was just my dad would try to find different opportunities to kind of go through the world and try to build a better life for us. And so he would just, whenever there was a new opportunity, he would bring the family along, basically.
Yeah, no, that's true. Well, so, and how long you been in California now?
So I moved to California in 2013. I came here for law school. So I've been here about 7 years.
And how is that? So what did you concentrate in law school, and why?
I actually focused on environmental law in law school. And the reason I focused on it, this is kind of a crazy story, I think, but it's another thing that formed my development. In Texas, I worked for a law firm. They did land use and real estate. And I'd never really known what that was before I started working for them. I never really had an opportunity. None of the people in my family at the time, and even mostly true now, had any sort of like legal education or knew what the law was. So I had happened to get involved, and I happened to meet this one person through our alumni association for my undergraduate school. And he brought me on board for doing land use and real estate. And so most people don't know what that is. What it actually is basically it's like a lobbyist at the local government level. Like when they're doing project developments, when they're building a lot of these like housing complexes or like malls, anything that they're building, and they try to get approval from the city. That's essentially what land use and real estate was. And so at some point, like I started learning more like what we were actually doing and being like, I don't know if this is the thing that I want to do. And I remember we had an election cycle, and the firm I was working for endorsed one candidate, and I was working on the campaign of an entirely different candidate who actually had more like of a progressive vision. And this was still Texas, so progressive in Texas is a whole other thing. But it still was much more in tune with my values. And I think at some point I decided I wanted to work for organizations where what they're fighting for was the same thing that I was fighting for. And so that kind of shifted me for law school. I was like, let me focus on something like basically the flip side of it, which I view as like environmental law and environmental protections. And that basically trajectory has kind of continued on ever since.
I'm trying to mute myself when you speak, just because I think that sound might be a little bit better. We have, technology. Welcome to the new world, right? Well, technology can help or fail anytime, actually. Oh boy. So environmental law, and then you do more on the housing. So what is the what was the connection? I mean, you mentioned the land use, which is extremely important in so many ways. Not too many people, I think, consciously sort of like and presented how much actually it matters. But what was the connection for you?
So my first my summer internship after my first year of law school, I basically had this choice between working for Tenants Together, the nonprofit that focuses on tenants' rights, and going back to that same firm. They'd offer me the chance to do another, like a 1-year summer internship there. And so I was like, I'm going to do something that's going to like make a difference. So I did Tenants Together, and my experiences doing a lot of local law was really relevant for Tenants Together. And so that's why they wanted to bring me on board. But getting involved in housing and seeing the connections between the environment and housing there, that sort of pretty much put me in the specialization of focusing on tenants' rights in particular.
What are the connections for you? What are your connections that you see between the environment and housing?
So I think it's two different things. The one we talk about in the Sierra Club all the time that I think is really important is just as people are displaced, they're moved farther and farther away from the places that they work, which means to more vehicle miles traveled, which means to more emissions of carbon and other things. But I think on top of that, it's you look at things like housing in the Fruitvale area and how there's the lead and the paints in the different locations. And you look at how pretty much where you live really impacts your environment, and it impacts the opportunities that you have for what you can do to succeed in the future. It impacts your human health. If you don't have it impacts your mental health if there's not parks and open spaces near you. All these things are tied together. And I think that the more and more I work in these two fields, the more I see the intersections between them really intensely.
Yeah, that's very true. You know, I'm very sort of passionate and curious about health, about human health, and just more I read and more I learn, it's so obvious how our environment influences not only our health, our health and our behavior, and our, what we breathe, what we, like lead. It's just, it has so many behavioral consequences, actually, the lead poison and stuff. So I think we need to make that connection more and more, and bring it to various, governmental structures and sort of elected officials for them to know and understand, because I think that connection is lost sometimes, and I think that more we advance that knowledge. I think it's probably, I feel definitely the responsibility for that. So where
do as well.
do you live? You live in Berkeley now, right?
Correct.
Okay. And so why did you invite, Berkeley and Oakland are very close, but why did you decide to get involved with the Centro Legal, and are you just passionate in doing work anywhere where it's needed, or the Centro Legal had some special meaning for you?
So it was an opportunity to do, because my job prior to Centro was working in Congresswoman Barbara Lee's office, and I think that I really
I'd like to mention that you
yes.
that's actually, actually now I was like, I think we met, I don't remember even through that or through Sierra Club. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
It may have been both at the time, honestly. But I think that, so one of the challenges is I went to the Congresswoman's office having had a law degree at the time, and you can't give legal advice when you're working for an elected official's office. And so one of the advantages of moving to Centro was finally being able to say, like, okay, I can actually now, it was really frustrating to be in an office and tenants would come in and I would hear the challenges they would say, and I'd be like, I can't give you legal advice, but here is this organization who probably can, and they can help you. And it felt in some ways like it just felt a little defeating. And I think taking the skill set of working with directly with clients and taking that to policy advocacy was another thing that really interested me as well. And so actually going to Centro at the same time too, I was with my supervisor at Tenants Together, ended up getting a job at Centro. And so it was a mixture of a lot of different factors. I knew I'd worked with her in the past, Leah Simon Weisberg. And I knew that she was someone who I could definitely work with again. And so that really made it just kind of a good fit and a good move for me at the time.
A small community. I know Leah, of course, too.
Yeah, yes.
Glad we could. That's right. So maybe you can share some stories, because now, especially and how, especially now shifting, with the crisis that we're going through. The tenant rights were always very important, because displacement is just huge, and especially in the economic boom when so many people got displaced, and you probably know better than I do, count in time when people, I think there was a lot of revelations there when We did count in time where people go and count and talk to homeless people and understand where they're coming from. And there was a lot of actually good points that a lot of people, a huge percentage actually local residents who got displaced, and people a lot of times think, oh, people are coming from somewhere because it's California. It was like, no, it's not true. Look at the data, people actually been displaced. So how do you see shifting now? And do you think, predictions, do you think that the crisis exaggerated that problem, or do you see some hope and solutions? I know it's a small question, but
yes. I mean, I think at the end of the day, for us to have hope and solutions, it really comes from what our community is willing to come together and meaningfully take a step to do. So I always have hope that there will be solutions, but it's dependent on who's willing to put in the work and who's willing to speak up and voice the concerns and actually take steps and actions. But I do think that we already had a housing crisis going on. COVID is just adding a whole new layer to it. And I think that especially people who are just losing jobs and employment right now, there's protections against evicting tenants, but at the same time, what we're seeing as well is property owners don't really care that there's protections, and they oftentimes are doing things to harass tenants. Sometimes we've seen them illegally locking tenants out, and we've had to reach out to the city attorney's office to remind property owners that that's actually entirely illegal, and that there's criminal sanctions that can go along with it too. But I think the other thing too, though, is that even before the crisis, one of the other challenges we had is there are tenants who are living in basically substandard housing, and that has its own stability issues. It has its own, because for housing like that, there are reasons that property owners can evict tenants, even though what they're giving them is not actually even meeting basic human needs. So I think that we have to be really strategic and thoughtful in how we move forward, because at the end of the day, this is just adding another layer to an already existing problem.
Yeah, what are the stories that you see? I mean, because you are communicating directly with people, and I think it would be helpful for people to hear directly from maybe have some people, some families that stood out for you.
I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail because of attorney-client privilege, but I think that
no name.
I'm thinking of one tenant in particular who really actually was completely locked out from their unit because the owner was just tired of dealing with them. And we did have to reach out to the city attorney's office to get them to take actions. We sent messages to the property owner to tell them this is illegal. The city attorney's office sent messages to the property owner to say this is illegal. I think at the end of the day, the tenant mentioned that they've actually stopped harassing them. And I think it was partly because they just didn't realize it's illegal to change the locks and lock a tenant out. The tenant actually said once we took the steps to call them and contact them, they realized how illegal what they were doing was. But the things people are doing, like it's disheartening a lot of the time. I think that's why we want to be there. That's why I want to be there, to make sure that we can stop things like that from happening again in the future as much as we can.
Yeah, imagine that you probably do a lot of education of tenants and landlords about tenants' rights and about vice versa. So how do you do that? Because the need is so huge.
So my role at Centro mostly revolves around actually arguing in front of the Oakland Rent Adjustment Program. I've done probably more than 50 cases or so in front of them in the past year or so. And so what that mostly focuses on is illegal rent increases. I focus on addressing tenants who've had bad conditions that the owners haven't fixed or addressed, or tenants who have property owners who take away some of the services that they provided, such as like parking, or like laundry services, just different things that people sometimes have as a part of their leases. And I found that it's actually usually easier to represent a tenant when the other side has legal representation too. And the reason for that is they have someone it's another voice telling them this is what the law is. Because for so many property owners, they just don't know what the actual laws in Oakland are. And if you have a legal background, you can look at what you need to do to understand what they are. But that's the hardest time, is just people who aren't as familiar with the law, or people who don't live in California and buy property in California and don't realize that we have a whole different system of how we regulate property here. And they think that they can just do whatever they want with their property, and it's not the case. Housing's a human right here, we fight for it to be a human right, and so we try to protect that right.
It's very true, and I think that we sometimes pass laws and regulations, but the implementation of them and education and sort of how do we disseminate that information, especially I think when I work with the government, we always concentrate. It's like, how do we disseminate information not only to English speakers, but to incorporate at least as much as we can. I mean, government resources, I think that people a lot of times don't understand that government resources are not, especially local governments, are not unlimited. So it's always knowing how to do a lot with a little.
Yes.
So if you have some, tricks, some advice, some, creative ideas, I would love to hear them, because I think we all sort of always trying to figure it out. I don't know what worked. Do you email? Do you go door to door? How do you disseminate information for tenants?
So I think for us, we have different teams of people who try to do outreach to tenants as well. So they do door-to-door knocking. They work with organizations like ACE to do tenants unions and collective argument. I think the thing we should be cognizant of is we kind of all have a different role that we play in it. So I think that working with government officials, they have a particular role in creating the laws and legislation. I think that there are certain things that even at Centro, we don't necessarily take every single case. There's some things that are better for a private attorney to take. And that's usually cases where there's attorney's fees allowed at the end, because it gives them the financial incentive to be willing to take them. And so for something like that, we don't offer as much resources for it, because if there's a different space that can fill that. I think the fact that we provide funding for legal services organizations in the Bay Area, that is another tremendous way to help enforce the rights and enforce the law. Because when you actually, I think one of the things I didn't realize before working in a legal space was that the laws are really just ideas. They don't actually mean anything until you do something to enforce them, and until people actually know to comply with them. And I think that, at least when I was growing up, that was something I think I took for granted. I just thought, oh, there's a law, that means everyone does it and it's cool now, but it's really not the case. And so I think that we just kind of have to be strategic in all these different spaces to make sure that the laws we're creating have the proper mechanisms and levers in place to actually be enforced.
And is that why you, so the board that you're running for in Berkeley, is that the law creating body, or is it, so what role does it have?
Yeah, so they're kind of the enforcement body, I think is the best way to look at it. The Berkeley Rent Stabilization Board.
I'm always, that's the one. I know Berkeley. It makes perfect logical sense, but sometimes like anyway.
It's a lot. But it's basically the same thing that the organization is that I argue in front of in Oakland. It's the same thing in Berkeley. So they provide enforcement for illegal rent increases in the city of Berkeley, enforcement for bad conditions, and decreases in services as well. And the way that they operate is they basically apply the laws of the city of Berkeley, the state of California, and they also make determinations on petitions filed either by tenants or petitions filed by property owners as well. And they have the ability to make administrative regulations as well too, so that it basically helps to give more guidance on how to interpret the laws in the city of Berkeley too. So it's a mixture of both.
So in Oakland, you're going to be arguing before the board, and in Berkeley, we'll be sitting on the board.
Yes.
Nice.
Well, and well, I think you were going to say it, but like getting the kind of feeding the experiences back from each one another, I think is going to be helpful.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to make you better on both sides, actually, because you're getting both perspectives and how to navigate them. I think but that, yeah, I'm curious actually. Do you see similarities and differences in Berkeley and Oakland? I mean, they're so close, but they're still such different jurisdictions. So any differences or similarities?
So I think Berkeley's protections are actually quite a bit stronger than Oakland's. Oakland's doesn't go quite as far, and um, there's little peculiar things in the way that Oakland applies its rules and regulations and some of the cases that have been before the Oakland board that make it somewhat more challenging in some ways. So that's one of the things I'm looking to do moving forward, is really find the best of both worlds and see which one like fits in other places. I think, yeah.
One of the questions that comes a lot, and sort of at least when I was working on housing issues, also sort of especially from people who a lot of times fighting the tenants' rights, the question of low-income house owners, and it's true, there are people who don't own 10 properties, but they rent. So what is your view how to make sure that talking about balanced laws is like how to make sure that we are doing something for people who truly this is their only income, or they were saving for retirement. I know it's I don't know if it's controversial or not, but
I mean, some people think it's controversial, but I actually don't think it's all that controversial. I do think that the smaller property owners who do have lower incomes, they also tend to not have the resources to get legal advice. And so, as I mentioned earlier, that's usually the situation where people are most likely not to comply with the law. And so I think it's incumbent upon the rent boards and just us as a society to make sure that the information on how to comply with the law is out there. From a practical standpoint, having argued cases and having had to negotiate settlements, I found that the people who don't fully understand the law are usually the most difficult to work with, because they have one idea of what they think it is. And usually I found usually for someone like that, I can't really get a settlement until we go in front of the rent board, and they have the rent board people, the rent board staff and the hearing officers will say, well, actually the law says this. And I'm like, that's what I've been telling you. But now that you've heard it from someone who's not me, then we can like come to the table and have a conversation and try to and actually resolve the issues as they stand. But I think that, yeah.
So basically it boils down to conversations, and sometimes hearing the thing that you don't want to hear from several people.
Yes. Conversations, and even more so, I would say it's just information. Like, are we giving the information out to all the people who need it?
Mm-hmm. And I also noticed, working in government, I think that when you write laws and the regulations follow, I mean, we need to make sure that the staff who writes the regulations really clear on the law and the intention of the law. And then, they are able to articulate those regulations in a way that is, you're a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, but I wrote, and participated in enough legislation. And I was like, what the hell does it say?
I'm not quite a lawyer yet. I have one last step, but almost there.
Well, and sometimes, obviously different people have different styles, but legal language sometimes is like, okay, can you please translate it to me? Okay, my first language is Russian. I'm not talking about that. I was like, can you translate me from the law language to the real language? Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to say that too, because one of the things I've dealt with recently is actually, I have a client who is a monolingual Russian speaker, but they have a daughter who lives with them who basically is bilingual, speaks Russian, but also is actually an attorney too. And so it's interesting navigating the hearing process and having someone who simultaneously speaks the language the tenant speaks and also has a legal background, because when we were going through the translations, they were like, actually, that's not quite what that means in Russian. Here's the more accurate way of portraying this. And it was just, it kind of shows you the power of having not only someone who speaks the language you speak serving as an advocate, but also who has that same legal background. Because really, at the end of the day, that was basically translating two different languages, translating the legal language and then Russian.
Oh, that's interesting. And like not many Russians, especially in government. It's very true, and language differences actually come in so many ways, because it really is. You need to know both languages very well to to be able to relay the meaning, not just the words, because the words can, you can direct translate and it just not going to land at all. So wow, that sounds challenging. How, do you work a lot with translators, and what is the experience aside from Russian?
So we use a lot of translators at Centro. We have a lot of monolingual Spanish speaking clients. And so I actually know some Spanish. And so in that context, it's a little different because since I know the language more, I don't know, I'm not fluent by any means whatsoever, but I do know enough Spanish that when I'm asking questions in the hearing, I can ask them in a way that gets to what I'm trying to actually get the client to say or elucidate in the client. But that's one of the things I think about looking at the Berkeley Rent Board is access to translators. And I think with COVID, we've shifted all the hearings for a lot of different organizations to be remote. And it is a challenge to do that sort of argumentation. One, it's even a challenge doing it in a regular setting because it's just so many different languages. I've been in hearings where the property owners speak one language and they have the interpreter for that language. And then we have the tenants who speak a different language. And it adds a lot of complexity and nuance that people have to be prepared to navigate.
So it's like triple translation. And you know what, I also just dawned on me that I didn't even think about that. Yes, we are not in normal times. So how do you navigate? And it's also the technological gap, because how people accessing those hearings, how do you deal with it? Some people don't have even unlimited data or phone. Anyway, I mean, what are the sort of situations that you observe that you have to overcome?
So that's definitely one of them. And I don't know that we've really gotten to a point that we have very clear solutions for it, because for some people, if they don't have access to a phone or to a computer or other technology to do remote hearings, the only thing that has been really offered so far is basically just doing the hearing later in time. And for some tenants, that's fine because maybe they're not paying any legal rent increase right now. But for other tenants who are, for whatever reason, facing like a really terrible conditions or other things, delaying the hearings can be really problematic. And so I think we are still trying to figure out how to navigate that space. Usually what that requires us doing, I think, is we actually will take more actions to try to just reach out to the owner directly rather than going through the hearing process. Because if we can just talk with them, explain the situation to them, explain their risks and their liability, that can get them to act. And we can sometimes come to an agreement before we even have to go through the hearing itself. But I think that, as I mentioned earlier, that's much more difficult if they're an owner who doesn't have access to legal resources or doesn't know the law or doesn't have that information.
And I think that a lot of, and I have to be honest, I mean, I'm a first generation immigrant, so I definitely had my fair share of hardships in many ways, but I have to say I've been lucky to always been able to sustain certain lifestyle, and I said that if I wouldn't, I probably would be so miserable here that I would have to go back to Russia, because it would not be. But I think that a lot of times we're really not cognizant of the level of difficulties people have to overcome to do something or to be somewhere. And Wi-Fi, I was like, it cost, I don't know, how much, but it cost, some data cost. So, and a lot of times I think that what I'm reflecting when I came to the United States, there were a lot of things that I didn't know. I didn't even know what to ask for. And I still don't sometimes, it's just, so how do you relay that information to people in a way that they know where to look for, where to go to ask? That's really challenging. And I think that's something that we all should be working on. Well, I'm curious, because you are in an interesting position because you're working with Centro Legal, you're working with communities on the ground, and you're also volunteering with the Sierra Club. So are there any projects that you're excited to do within the Sierra Club and sort of advance, and what is your sort of vision, aspiration?
So I think one of the things that I've always enjoyed doing is I kind of like being a connector for a lot of different groups at the same time. Mm-hmm. I think that The reason I joined the Sierra Club, honestly, was mostly because it's an organization that has been around for such a long time and has a lot of influence, but at the same time, it doesn't have as much diversity in its perspectives as I would ultimately like to see. And so I think where I found myself enjoying involvement is bringing different perspectives and different groups to the Sierra Club and helping the Sierra Club to look at not just from an environmental lens, but an environmental justice lens, because I think that's two different things. And I think the space that I can most effectively do that in is mostly around the intersection of housing and the environment, but I think it overlaps in other ways. So the conversations that are going on right now about the budget for different cities and like how much money they're investing in police, I think that's one of the spaces I'm looking forward to the Sierra Club's conversation moving forward. Locally, we've supported the movement to defund the police, and I think I honestly didn't know where that was going to go before we voted on it, but I'm very glad that we've done that. And I think that the next step is like, what does that practically mean, and how do we practically do this in our cities and our jurisdictions? And I think there's a wave right now, and I hope that that wave lasts. But I also know that, I mean, I remember protesting for Trayvon Martin. I remember being in the streets in Berkeley years ago when I was still in law school, protesting these same issues. And I'm hopeful. Again, it's like what I said earlier, I'm hopeful that it can change. And I believe with people supporting it, things can change. But I recognize that it's going to be a big challenge too. So.
Yes, and it is, it is the issue that I think cannot be superficial. I think that we touched a little bit before we went live. There are so many vulnerabilities, and there's so many fears and so many, I think conversations that need to be had, in all different settings, and feelings not expressed are bottled and expressed in some other ways, not in usually not in good ways. Psychology still applies everywhere. So I agree with you. I'm very happy that the club supported defund the police. I think that a lot of times people, that particular term, they misunderstand it probably, or don't research it maybe enough to understand what it actually means. And I'm wondering actually your perspective of sort of short-term, long-term, if you thought about what are the solutions now and what are solutions sort of going forward? What can help us move towards the truly inclusive society? I mean, we can take Sierra Club as an example. I think that Sierra Club is just an example. I think there's so many organizations that are, grappling with the same. I absolutely agree. And if we look at our ex-coms, we are white predominantly. So it's just a fact. So how do we move towards, looking at our ex-coms memberships and seeing, we truly represent our communities. So anyway, I'm curious.
So I think thinking more about the audience we're speaking to too, I want to kind of elaborate on the defund movement. And I think how this all fits together, because I think at the end of the day, when I look at the East Bay, I feel like it's very segregated. Mm-hmm. Particularly segregated from an economic lens. When you see like our West Berkeley community, our South Berkeley communities, when you see West Oakland, East Oakland, Deep East Oakland, it's like there's just different worlds from everywhere else in our communities. And the funding that we get in these different spaces and the opportunity and access to resources in these spaces is so different and so vastly different. And in undergrad, I was a sociology major, and there's this one theory that basically says when you don't have opportunity, when you don't have ways for people to advance and live and thrive, you have a deterioration in social structure and social order. And that if you just provide these basic necessities and these basic things, that's what brings society back together. And I think at the end of the day, that's really what the defund movement is trying to say, is that we don't think that coming in with law enforcement and like you are criminal, you need to be punished sort of standpoint is going to actually address these massive inequalities and inequities that have existed in society for hundreds of years. That at the end of the day, that if we invest in mental health services, if we invest in economic opportunity, if we invest in education, if we invest in all these things that have historically been disinvested in, we just won't need police as much, and we can bring them to do different jobs and different services and to have them be parts of our communities. It's not that, I mean, I don't know. And I'm still struggling with this too, honestly, because it's not like my focus has always been housing and the environment. And this has been an issue that I've cared about, but I have been feeling fairly hopeless about for a really long time. And so I want to do a shout out to all the movements and the people that are really doing the leadership on this issue, because it's not me. It's really not me. I think I'm some people's only connection to those groups, but it's not me doing that work. So I would point out to like Kat Brooks and the Anti-Police Terror Project. Like there are people out there who are really, really doing this work, and it's not me. And I think that that's the other thing we as the Sierra Club have to keep in mind too, is that even if I'm a person of color, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm the face of this movement at all. I might be the most directly connected from what people can see, but at the end of the day, like it's not me leading this charge, and it's not me at the forefront of the fight. And we have to make sure we're connected with the people who are. I think you're on mute, Olga.
I'm talking to myself.
I was worried. I was like, did my sound cut out?
Good, right? No, that's why I was trying to. It was like because I was trying to mitigate the sound, so that's why I was like, la la la. No, I think it's important to your point, and that's why we starting to, I think, talk and why I'm hopeful for this moment in time also, because I see that people are starting to, what are the strategies? What are the actions? What are the things that we need to start putting in place, changing now? You know, not, you know, now we're working on strategic plan, you know, thank you for joining the team for 5 years. But no, I mean, this is a long-term strategy, long-term solutions. What do we need? What do we need to do now? And I think that there's a lot of sort of imperfect action that comes with, you know, people saying things that are insensitive or saying in a way, you know, and I had this conversation with my friend yesterday. I was like, oh my God, I see this message that I was like, this is terrible in terms of there's like assumptions and just, you know, application coming from a named white man. But then I was like, and she's like, Olga, you know what, but he's trying. He is, the intention is there. So, and I think that there's so many emotions right now, and we're all in different space of the different level of emotion. So some people are ready to talk and teach, and some people is like, screw you, you know, I don't have to. And you're right, you don't have to, absolutely. And everybody has a right to just be, and not, you know, be in that space of constant, you know, fear and education. So, but I think that your perspective, you know, is so important because you are also communicating with communities directly. And I think what my vision, my desire would be that every leader within the Sierra Club and other organizations actually takes time to go to meetings of, you know, community, because there are, you know, different, okay, starting to tear up, I'm sorry. But there, I mean, truly, there's so many opportunities to join, you know, organizations meetings, community meetings, and communities that you generally don't go to. And I think that on the ground understanding what people are actually dealing with day in and day out, to your point, if a child doesn't have enough to eat, they're not going to be learning in school. They're not going to be behaving in school, you know. And I think that those connections that are so crucial to make. And I think until you really see and talk to people and hear them, I think you viscerally do not really understand. So, and I think that's, you know, I'm sorry. I'm like, it's your, you know, I'm talking to you, but I'm ending up talking.
I mean, these are not simple issues that we're trying to resolve, and I think they're not going to be resolved overnight, and they're connected in so many different ways. But I think that's, to your point though, what you've said, I think what it takes is us recognizing that, like, it's not just an issue of the environment. It's not just an issue of environmental justice. Everything is connected in so many different ways, shapes, or forms that we have to, with any action we take, think about it from every other issue area's lens. And I think that's one of the things I think I learned. I think I saw it before before I worked in the Congresswoman's office, but I think I distilled it to a point where I really, really understood it, because I would go to a meeting about environmental issues on one day, and then the next day it'd be an issue, or we'd be talking about housing issues, or even working around HIV and AIDS, like all these things. If you ask someone who works around HIV and AIDS advocacy and like trying to address the crisis going around with HIV and AIDS still, their first thing they're going to say that they're trying to fix is the housing crisis, because you can't get treatment if your treatment's not going to be effective and stable if you don't have a place to live. There's so many underlying things that have to be addressed together. So I've been encouraging the Sierra Club that even as we think about what it means to have a good environmental record, to me, a good environmental record means you have a good record on education. It means you have a good record on police accountability. It means you have a good record on labor. It means you have a good record. Like, we can't just look at the environment as when we decide what an environmental record is, because none of those other things are going to be resolved until we think about them all together.
And I think it's so important what you're saying right now, because we do get, unfortunately, that those inquiries still, why we are an environmental organization, why are we getting engaged in housing, affordable housing, renters protections, police reform, etc. And I think you articulate, the way that people need to hear it, because until you address the person being and address all of their needs first, they cannot think about the bigger picture. Or they can probably, I'm generalizing horribly, obviously, you realize that, but if you're hungry, if you don't have comfortable home, it's just, I know know for myself, if I'm underslept, I'm not as wise and enlightened as I want to be. So how to fix those things? And I think that a lot of people are struggling probably with that. And I'm curious, what do you think we should do? What are the sort of concrete steps that we can, me, Olga Bolotina, can take, people in the club can take, that would be meaningful?
So I think the Black Panther Party actually had a really good model for doing this. If we are able to address for a moment people's basic needs, we can help free up the space for them to have conversations about tougher things. If you have spent all day working somewhere in San Francisco and you have to do a 2-hour drive to get back home to where you actually are living, and you have children who you have to feed and you barely made enough money to feed them, someone coming at you and saying, hey, let's go talk about planting more trees in Piedmont is not going to be something you want to sit down and listen to. Even if you believe in the environment, even if you are someone who deep down at your core really wishes that we had green space everywhere, you're not going to have the energy for that. So I think the way that the Sierra Club can bring different perspectives in is and this is not just true of the Sierra Club, this is true of any other organization. If we are providing food, childcare, education, lowering the cost of transportation to get places, that's how we get communities organized and to be a part of it and to address the issues. When we free people up to have the space to have conversations about these things and we take some of the burdens off of their bearing, I think that's the most we can do right now, more than anything.
Yes, and of course my mind immediately goes, like, how to actionably do that. It was like who to bring, it was like how to reach for, because there's a, the group of youth was marching in Berkeley Hills, and wake up. And I think the question is like, okay, well, what can we do other than put the signs in the windows? It's like, I think to me the answer is, and I wonder what you think, it's like, yeah, donate to organizations who they're in the Bay Area. There are definitely plenty of organizations who you can donate to that can provide meals or can provide care, or go volunteer. I think that now is probably a little bit more difficult, and a lot of people, especially older population, is probably more concerned about COVID, and we still do have to worry about that, obviously. But I think that there are a lot of young people who are willing to safely serve the community. So but a lot of times probably lack resources, financial resources to do that. So I think that the people with means can look? I mean, maybe you have some suggestions where to donate, what to do, what do you see are the most sort of valuable actions, I would say, that people can take?
I can give a list of different organizations to donate to, but I think because I know even when we say this, there's gonna be people who are gonna be like, I just don't have the time to do that. I don't have the space to do that. I don't have the my own space to be able to commit to that. So I think the first thing anyone can do is really to just think about what spaces are you already in and already a part of, and what can you do to make that space better or different. So maybe if you're someone who works in a space and like maybe you're a tech worker, you can work on diversifying the people in your organization. And if you do that, you'll help address this underlying problem as well too. For example, I'm trying to think, like if you are a government agency and you do contracting, what are you looking at in terms of data for ensuring that you're getting access to communities that haven't historically had access? If we just take the step to think about like, okay, maybe I can't go like volunteer, maybe I don't have the financial resources to donate, but I am in this space right now and I can change this space that I'm in right now. I think that's the first step. And then after that, I would say look at communities that are I think have a critical lens with the groups that you want to donate to, because there's some that do environmental issues, but they don't really do environmental justice. And I think the most important thing is, are they uplifting the voices of those who are impacted, or are they speaking on behalf of those who are impacted? And if the answer to that question is they're speaking on behalf of those who are impacted, that's usually not the type of organization I would recommend supporting or uplifting.
Yeah, and also I think it's important to educate those organizations too.
Yes.
Educated is loaded, sort of. I think that education is sort of conversation, really, because I think that people getting aha moments in conversations or experiences, so it's not, I'm not saying, just regurgitate information, but I think it has to be, especially in this space, I think the conversations, as difficult as they are, as much as, a lot of people don't want to have them, but only out of those conversations get really sort of realization and embodiment. So, and I'm looking forward to working together really to make sure that we put tangible, really actionable, and really measurable solutions to put our actions to where our words been for a while, and I agree with you. I also participated in a lot of protests, and I was like, well, how is it different? And it's like, I always feel like, damn, we should put on this, we should put a voting registration table, or sign up for membership table for organizations to capture all of those people who are protesting, but sort of splash in time, and then it goes, But I think now also because of COVID, so many people at home, and people are actually having more time to give it their thought and also taken action. So, and one of the things I'm curious, because I got into environmental protection because I legitimately was like, I love the birds and the bees. I mean, they cannot speak for themselves even. We need to speak for them. So I'm wondering why environmental protection, I honestly feel, when I'm watching like Discovery Channel, I'm like, oh my God, my whole being is just flourishing, and our planet is so beautiful. So I'm wondering what inspires you in an environmental space also.
There's kind of two things in particular that got me to be part of the environmental space. It was one, I did debate in high school, and I did a lot of research around environmental racism, and that seeing just the disparities, that's part of how I got involved. But I think the more like kind of base level of how I got involved is my dad really loved sports and really, really wanted me to love sports, and I didn't. I really was not good. I was terrible. My sister was great though. And so I would go to like her basketball games and like football games and soccer games. And then I would like watch for a bit, and I'd be like, okay, I'm kind of bored. And I would like walk around, and I just walk into the parks that they were in. And so I ended up just falling in love with the environment in that way, out of like a distaste for sports. And so like, I still resonate with the idea of like having green space and having trees and having open air and having fresh air and like a wonder for nature. But I want everyone to be able to have that too. And I think that's those two things working together is kind of the combination of where I come from around the environment.
And it's true. And I heard somewhere, not my thought, but what you don't love, you don't want to save. So And so I'm not resignated because I was like, why do I want to save the environment so much? Because I love it. Because, I grew up going to forest and wilderness and just really like touching, feeling, sensing nature. And I want to, and I think community up in this country, especially not ever, in the area, never been to, to close by park. And we have so many of them. So I think that another thing, and I know Sophie Hahn talks about that all the time, also, so our Berkeley City Council member, and also Sierra Club, Northern Alameda County ExCom member. It's like, what can we do in the community that is tangible, that is like actionable, that really makes change in those. So I think that there's a lot more planning and room for action, for sure. Well, we coming to, there's so many more things that I want to ask, and I'm kind of thinking, it's like, oh my, we should do a panel discussion. Just there's so many things to unpack and talk about. But something that I didn't ask you that you want to share, something that you think is important for people to hear in this moment in time, that you want to, talk about.
This is another thing that probably could spin off into an entirely different discussion, but I think sort of in tune with doing the influence you can in the spaces you're already in. I think one of the things that, and one of the reasons why I think we have to recognize that all these movements are connected goes back to, I think, my experience being both Black and queer at the end of the day. And I think that particularly growing up in Texas, I felt like, spending a lot of my life in Texas anyway, I felt like there was always this like wall and separation between these two communities in my life. And I've never really felt like they were tied together as one. I'd be in spaces that were queer and it was predominantly white people, and I'd be in spaces that were Black, and oftentimes they really didn't support same-sex rights or queer rights or trans rights or any of those sorts of rights. And I remember not liking the feeling of these two groups that were trying to fight for what was needed in society, and feeling like they were speaking two different languages. And so for me, I don't want to ever do that. I'm still live. Olga, are you still there? Did it drop out?
I think we did drop out completely.
Oh no. It says recording live on Facebook still. I don't know. I'll leave it up to wonder and mystery.
Boy. Sorry, everybody. Technology again. I don't know. I was like, I'm reaching out for my hotspot and stuff. So I missed everything. I mean, I missed everything that you were saying. So I'm
okay. She just said we're still live. Maybe they did catch that. I mean, at the end of the day. Long story short.
We're back.
So long story short, like, I just think we have to recognize, it goes back to the idea of recognizing the movements are connected, and we have to be willing to fight for all these causes and see that we're still fighting for the same things at the end of the day.
So I actually want to hear the longest story.
I'll tell you after.
Minutes, so I was like, I want to offline. But you're right, and I think more we have those conversations, and more we invite to each other. I mean, people from similar. You started with that sometimes you go from one place to another, and it's like totally different worlds. That one city, but they completely disconnected from lifestyles, discussion. Understand. I mean, even if we don't, we don't have to accept everybody's lifestyle. I mean, you can choose, but respect. I think that's the most important thing. It's like, even if you don't understand, respect others' rights to do what they want to, as long as they're not harming anybody else and the environment. So I think it's very important. I don't know if I'm putting words in your mouth, but
it makes sense to me.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Any last words for our audience of inspiration or motivation?
Just, I don't know, just stick to the movement and keep fighting. That's all we can do. I don't know if that's motivating or not, but that's what we have to do, I guess.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Every day, let's not have it another, be a splash in the moment. Let's put things in place that change the system forever, that not only our planet survive, but everybody on the planet survives also and has equal rights and equal. Xavier, thank you so much. I love you. I appreciate you. I appreciate you doing all the work. I appreciate you coming today and reshuffling your schedule. I know it's extremely busy, and I'm very, very grateful. And I hope that we continue the conversation. Maybe we will, maybe we should think about some panel discussion on a specific topic. So that would be probably good. Well, I invite you, and I would hope you would join. Let's think about it.
I'd love to, and thank you for everything that you're doing. I'm enjoyed being on the ground fighting with you as well. So I'm looking forward to what we can do in the future.
Yay! Fight together. Well, peace together. Peace together. Peace together. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Please join us next Friday also. And Xavier, I hope you can join also to watch HOP. And we'll continue the conversation. Thank you so much. Have a great Friday and a great weekend, everybody. Bye. Bye.